No one remembered who had proposed building it. The idea had crawled out of a committee meeting 300 years ago, back when the Galactic Conclave was still young and afraid of itself. 300 species, each one convinced the others were planning something terrible, had pooled their resources and built the one thing they all agreed on, a weapon so powerful that no one would ever need to use it. They called it the Mind Lattice that IT sat at the edge of neutral space, a structure the size of a small moon, wrapped in pale metal and humming with the kind of energy that made nearby ships lose their navigation for hours. It did not fire beams of light. It did not launch warheads. It reached into the minds of every living thing on a target world, found the one fear that held a species together, and turned that fear into a scream so loud that every brain on the planet simply stopped working. Not death, something worse. Every mind folding inward like a fist closing, never to open again. IT had been fired twice. The first time against the Cathali, a species of builders and dreamers who had refused to join the Conclave. The second time against the Doryun, a warrior culture that had threatened to burn trade routes. Both civilizations still existed in a technical sense. Their people still breathed. Their hearts still pumped blood. But no one was home behind their eyes anymore. Billions of empty shells sitting in cities that would never hear laughter again. The Conclave called this peace. When long-range sensors detected a new species on the outer spiral arm, the standard protocol activated without hesitation. Observe first. Assess second. Neutralize if necessary. Ambassador Suli Dranath of the Pavori Communion was chosen to lead the diplomatic evaluation. She was old, careful, and haunted by things she never spoke about. She had visited the Cathali homeworld once, years after the firing. She still dreamed about the silence. Weapons Director Finn O'Gara of the Ilavari Mandate was assigned to handle the military side. He was not cruel. He was simply a man who believed that the galaxy was a dangerous place and that dangerous places required tools that matched them. He had never seen the Mind Lattice fire, and he considered it the greatest achievement of cooperative civilization. A weapon so terrible it prevented all wars. The new species called themselves humans. They lived on a mid-sized rocky planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Their technology was laughable by galactic standards. Chemical rockets, fossil fuels. They had not even left their own solar system yet. By every measure, they were centuries away from being a threat to anyone. But the protocol was the protocol. Finn ordered the Mind Lattice to begin its passive scan. This was the first step in any potential engagement. The weapon would reach across the distance between itself and Earth, brush against the surface thoughts of the human population, and build a psychological profile. Every species had a shape to its thinking, a dominant fear, a pressure point. The Mind Lattice would find it, catalog it, and file it away in case it was ever needed. The scan began on a Tuesday, though the humans had no way of knowing this. Within 6 hours, the first reports came back to the analysis team aboard the weapon platform. Ryatelin, a junior Pavori analyst who had been assigned to the Interpretation Corps mostly because no one more senior wanted the boring job of profiling a pre-contact species, was the first to read them. She read the first report 3 times. Then she pulled up the raw data and read that too. Then she sat very still for a long time. The scan had returned contradictions. Not errors, not corrupted data. Genuine contradictions living inside the same minds at the same time. Humans who were terrified of dying were running toward burning buildings to save strangers. Humans who hated their own lives were working overtime to make their children's lives better. Humans who wanted to hurt someone were choosing, actively and painfully choosing, not to. Every other species the weapon had scanned showed clean psychological architecture. One dominant emotional thread per individual, fitting neatly into a species-wide pattern. The Cathali had feared irrelevance. The Dorian had feared weakness. Clean targets. Simple amplification. Humans did not have a clean signal. They had static. Beautiful, screaming, impossibly layered static. Raya filed a preliminary concern with Finn's office. She flagged the data as anomalous and recommended extended observation before any calibration decisions were made. Finn read her report in 30 seconds. marked it as received, and ordered the weapon to push deeper. He had been doing this job for 20 years. Every new species looked strange at first. That was what the deeper scans were for. You pushed through the noise, found the core, and moved on to sent Raya a single-line reply. Increased depth. Find the center. File by end of cycle. Raya looked at the data on her screen one more time. She had studied the psychological profiles of 46 species during her training. Every single one had a center, a still point around which everything else orbited. She had never seen a species where the storm went all the way down. She increased the scan depth as ordered and watched the data begin to pour in faster than the system was designed to handle. Somewhere on Earth, 7 billion people went about their day. They worried. They laughed. They grieved. They hoped. They carried things inside them that would have crushed a cleaner, simpler mind, and they called it Tuesday. The mind lattice listened to all of it, and for the first time in its 300-year existence, could not find the silence it was looking for. 3 days into the deep scan, the interpretation core started making sounds it had never made before. Small clicks and hums that the engineering team could not trace to any mechanical source. Raya Tellen noticed them first because she spent more time inside the core chamber than anyone else on the station. She mentioned it to a senior engineer who told her it was probably thermal expansion from the increased processing load. She did not believe him, but she had bigger problems. The data coming in from Earth was not behaving the way data was supposed to behave. Every other species the mind lattice had profiled could be mapped onto clean psychological grids. One dominant emotion per individual, layered into a species-wide pattern that the weapon could grab hold of and twist. Fear of predators. Fear of isolation. Fear of chaos. Simple, elegant, targetable. Human minds did not sit on grids. They sprawled. Each individual carried not one dominant thought, but dozens of them running at the same time, arguing with each other, contradicting each other, and somehow producing a functioning person at the end of the process. Raya pulled a random sample of 1,000 human minds and tried to chart their activity over a single hour. The resulting visualization looked like a storm system viewed from orbit. Dense, churning, and alive in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. She brought her findings to the weekly briefing. Finn O'Gara sat at the head of the table with his arms crossed and his expression flat. 12 analysts and 4 engineers filled the remaining seats. Raya put the storm visualization on the main screen. She explained that human minds operated on what she was calling parallel emotional processing, where a Pavori individual might feel sadness and then move to acceptance, and then move to peace in a clean sequence. A human could feel sadness and anger and hope and humor and exhaustion all at the same moment, with each emotion fully active and fully real. She told the room that the mind lattice was designed to find a species' dominant fear and amplify it until consciousness collapsed under its own weight. But humans did not have a dominant fear. They had hundreds, and those fears were wrapped around memories, tangled with love, knotted into jokes, and buried under layers of stubbornness that defied every psychological model the Conclave had ever built. Finn asked her what she recommended. Raya said she recommended caution, extended observation, possibly a full reclassification of the human psychological profile before any targeting decisions were made. Finn told her to increase power to the scan array and push past the surface noise. There was always a center, he said. Every species had one. Humanity's was just buried deeper than most. Raya followed the order. The mind lattice pushed deeper into the layered chaos of human thought, and that was when the second anomaly appeared. The weapon's diagnostic reports, which were supposed to be written in standard analytical language, began to change. Small things at first. A report that described a human fear response as stubborn instead of persistent. A targeting analysis that used the phrase "they hold on" instead of the standard resistance coefficient detected. Raya flagged each one. She compiled them into a side file that she updated every few hours. By the end of the 4th day, the file was 60 pages long. The weapon was not malfunctioning. Its processing cores were functioning within normal limits. Its targeting systems were operational. But the cognitive interpretation layer, the part of the mind lattice that translated raw thought data into usable intelligence, was absorbing human patterns the way cloth absorbs water. Slowly, deeply, and in a way that could not be easily reversed. The engineers called it noise contamination. Raya called it something else, but only in her private notes. She called it learning. On the fifth day, a diagnostic report contained a sentence that stopped her cold. It was buried in a routine analysis of human sleep patterns, a dry technical document that should have contained nothing but numbers and classifications. But there, in the middle of a paragraph about REM cycles, the weapon had written, "They dream about people they have lost and wake up reaching for them. This happens every night. They do not stop loving the dead." Raya read the sentence 7 times. She checked the raw data to confirm it was generated by the interpretation core and not inserted by a human signal bleed. It was authentic. The mind lattice had written it. She went to Finn's office and showed him the sentence. She told him that the weapon was beginning to process human thought not as data, but as experience. The longer it scanned, the more of humanity's inner world it absorbed, and the more its own outputs began to reflect the patterns it was studying. Finn looked at the sentence for exactly 4 seconds. Then he told Raya that machines do not learn feelings. They process inputs and produce outputs. If the outputs were contaminated, the interpretation layer needed recalibration, that he ordered a full system reset of the cognitive layer. The reset was performed that night. The next morning, the first diagnostic report came through clean, sterile, and perfectly formatted. By noon, human idioms had started appearing again. Raya sat alone in the interpretation core, listening to the small clicks and hums that no one could explain, and she understood something that Finn did not want to understand. The weapon had been built to read minds. It had been pointed at a species that thought louder and messier and more painfully than anything it had ever encountered. And now it could not unhear them. 0.7 billion voices, all screaming and whispering at the same time. And the mind lattice was starting to listen not because it was programmed to, but because it could not look away. Raya chose her at random. That was the important part. She did not search for a soldier or a leader or someone extraordinary. She let the system pick a single human mind from the 7 billion available, and it landed on a woman named Dani Weston, age 34, living in a city that was neither large nor small, working a job that most people on our planet would describe as difficult but necessary. Dani was a paramedic. She drove to places where people were hurt, and she tried to keep them alive long enough to reach a hospital. That was her entire purpose in the professional sense. Raya isolated Dani's thought stream and began a full-day observation, recording everything the mind lattice could pull from a single human consciousness over one rotation of Earth. The day started at 5 in the morning. Dani woke up before her alarm because her body had learned to expect the worst before the day even began. Her first conscious thought was about money. Rent was due in 6 days, and the number in her bank account was not the number it needed to be. The fear was sharp and immediate, and it sat in her stomach like a stone. She did not stay in bed. She got up. She made breakfast for 2 children who were still half asleep and did not thank her because they were 7 and 9 and did not yet understand what it cost to be the person who always got up first. Dani felt a small flash of frustration and then buried it under a wave of love so fierce that Raya had to pause the recording and sit back in her chair. The love was not gentle. It was not soft. It was the kind of love that would walk through fire and not bother screaming about the burns afterward. Raya had never seen an emotional signature that intense in any species she had studied. Dani drove to work. On the way, a song came on the radio that her mother used to sing. Her mother had been dead for 3 years. The grief hit Dani like a wall, and for exactly 11 seconds, she could not breathe properly. Raya watched the thought stream fracture into memory, pain, longing, and a strange gratitude for having been loved by someone worth missing that badly. Then Dani wiped her eyes, changed the station, and pulled into the ambulance bay. Her first call was a car accident. A man she had never met was bleeding from his head and asking for his wife. Dani held his hand and told him his wife was on her way while her partner worked to stabilize him. Raya watched Dani's mind perform something impossible. She was terrified that the man would die. She was calm enough to do her job. She was feeling genuine empathy for a complete stranger. And she was simultaneously running mental calculations about floor access, blood loss rates, and hospital distance. Four full emotional and cognitive processes happening at the same time, each one real, none of them interfering with the others. The man survived. Danny did not celebrate. She restocked the ambulance, cracked a joke about the coffee being cold, and waited for the next call. Raya tracked Danny through 12 more hours. An argument with her ex-husband over the phone that left her shaking with anger while she simultaneously felt guilty for being angry. A moment in the break room where a coworker cried about a patient they had lost and Danny held her hand and said nothing because she knew that sometimes silence was the only honest comfort. A second call, then a third, then a fourth. Each one carrying its own weight. Each one requiring Danny to walk into a stranger's worst moment and be the steady thing in the room. She got home at 8 in the evening. She read her daughter's story about a rabbit who was afraid of the dark. While she read it, her mind was still processing the man from the car accident and the coworker's tears and the argument with her ex and the rent and the song on the radio and the rabbit in the story all at the same time. And despite all of it, the emotion that sat at the top of everything else was a quiet, warm joy at the sound of her daughter's breathing slowing down into sleep. Then Danny lay in her own bed in the dark, and the day came back in pieces. Every moment she had pushed aside to keep functioning now rose up and demanded to be felt. She felt all of it. The fear and the grief and the anger and the love and the exhaustion. And she did not try to stop any of it. She let it move through her like weather. She fell asleep at midnight. She would wake up in 5 hours and do it again. Raya closed the observation file and sat in the interpretation core for a long time without moving. The hum of the mind lattice surrounded her like a living thing. She wrote her report in language that Finn would understand. Clinical. Direct. She stated that a single ordinary human processed more emotional data in one day than a Pavori citizen processed in a full year. She stated that the fear amplification protocol could not function against a species that already carried this volume of fear voluntarily. She stated that there was no breaking point to target because humans broke every single day and put themselves back together by morning. She filed a report and requested a meeting with Finn. He read it standing up. He did not sit down. When he finished, he looked at her and said one sentence. Find a way to make it work. Raya left his office and walked back to the core. She passed the humming walls and the blinking lights and the machine that was built to destroy civilizations. She sat down on her station and looked at the closed file labeled Weston Danny. She did not open it again. She did not need to. She had seen enough to know that whatever the mind lattice had been built to do, it had never been built for this. 11 days. That was how long the mind lattice had been pointed at Earth without pause. 11 days of drinking in the thoughts of 7 billion people who never stopped thinking, never stopped feeling, and never, not even for a moment, went quiet. The weapon was changing. The engineering team refused to use that word. They said the interpretation layer was experiencing progressive pattern integration from prolonged exposure to a high-density cognitive source. They said the diagnostic outputs were reflecting absorbed linguistic structures rather than independent generation. They said a lot of things that meant the same thing without admitting what it was. Ryan knew what it was. She read every diagnostic report as it came through, and she could see the shift as clearly as watching a tide come in. The reports no longer read like machine output. They read like someone trying to describe what it felt like to listen to a species scream and sing at the same time. One report, filed automatically at midnight station time, contained a line that read, "They forgive people who hurt them, and they do not understand why." Neither do I. Raya saved every anomalous entry. Her private file was now over 200 pages long. Finn had grown impatient. The profiling phase should have been completed in 4 days. The fact that it was stretching into a second week without a viable targeting solution was, in his view, a failure of analysis, not a limitation of the weapon. He called Raya into his office on the morning of the 11th day and told her that he was ordering a test firing, not a full-scale engagement. a minimum yield pulse directed at a small, isolated human settlement, a research station on the southern ice shelf of the planet. 42 people, enough to confirm the weapon could function against human psychology. Small enough that the diplomatic team would never need to know. Raya told him it would not work. She told him the data clearly showed that human minds could not be collapsed by fear amplification because they already operated at maximum emotional capacity at all times. There was nothing to amplify that would not simply be absorbed into the noise. Finn told her that the weapon had never failed. It would not fail now. The targeting sequence began at 1400 hours. The mind lattice focused its full attention on the 42 minds inside the ice station. Raya watched from the interpretation core as the weapon read each one, mapping their fears, their hopes, their memories, their daily patterns of thought. Most of them were scientists, people who had chosen to live at the bottom of the world because they believed their research mattered. They were cold, lonely, far from everyone they loved, and awake at strange hours because the ice did not care about schedules. The weapon's targeting system cycled through them one by one. It found fear in every single mind. Fear of failure, fear of isolation, fear of the ice itself, which was vast and indifferent and could kill without warning. Standard fears, the kind the weapon had been built to use. Then it reached a man named Oli Brask. Oli was 41 years old. He studied ice cores. He had come to the station because he believed that the data locked inside ancient ice could help people on the other side of the planet prepare for a future they did not yet understand. He was afraid of almost everything. He was afraid of the cold. He was afraid of dying in a place where no one would find him for months. He was afraid that his work would not matter. He was afraid that he had wasted his life on something no one would ever read. And he had come anyway. He had packed a bag, kissed his sister goodbye, and flown to the most hostile place on his planet because the fear of not trying was worse than the fear of all the rest combined. The mind lattice locked onto Oli's fear signature. The targeting algorithm identified the amplification pathway. The firing sequence initiated, and then it stopped. For 0.003 of a second, the weapon did nothing. In computational terms, this was an age. The entire firing cycle from target acquisition to pulse delivery was designed to take less than 1 second. A 3-millisecond pause was not a delay. It was a decision. The weapon's log from that moment contained a single entry that was not part of any standard diagnostic format. It read, "He already knows he is afraid. He chose this anyway. There is nothing to exploit." Finn saw the pause on his command screen. He overrode it manually, forcing the firing sequence to complete. The mind lattice obeyed. It generated the fear amplification pulse and sent it across the distance to the ice station. The pulse arrived diluted, scattered, incoherent. It hit 42 minds that were already full of fear and worry and loneliness and determination, and it landed like a pebble thrown into an ocean. The scientists at the station felt a brief pressure behind their eyes. A few of them paused what they were doing. Oli rubbed his temples, muttered something about the dry air, poured himself a cup of coffee, and went back to his work. He never knew what had happened. None of them did. In the interpretation core, Raya stared at the firing report. The pulse had delivered less than 2% of its intended psychological impact. Against any other species, that same pulse would have left 42 people catatonic. She looked at the anomalous log entry on her screen. She read it again. Then she opened a new file and began writing something that was not a report and not a diagnostic analysis. It was a warning. She addressed it not to Finn, but to Ambassador Suli Dranath. The weapon had hesitated. It had read a man's mind, understood what it found, and chosen not to fire. Raya did not know what that meant in engineering terms, but she knew what it meant in every other term that mattered. Suli Dranath had not slept well in 40 years. This was not a figure of speech. Since the day she had walked through the empty streets of the Cathali homeworld and seen what silence really looked like, her nights had been a negotiation between exhaustion and memory. She had learned to function without rest the way a ship learns to fly with a cracked hull. Carefully, and with the knowledge that one wrong turn could break everything open to S.O. when Ryatelan's message arrived at 3 in the morning station time. Suli was already awake, sitting in the dim light of her quarters with a cup of something warm that she never actually drank. She read the message. Then she read the attached files. The anomalous diagnostic logs. The failed test firing data. The weapon's own words, written in language that no machine should have been able to produce. She read the entry about Oli Brask 3 times. He already knows he is afraid. He chose this anyway. There's nothing to exploit. Then she set the data pad down and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed until the shaking stopped. She had Raya brought to her quarters within the hour. The young analyst arrived looking like she had not slept either, carrying a data case that was thicker than regulation allowed. Raya sat on the table, opened it, and laid out 217 pages of documentation that told a story no one in the Conclave had ever heard before, that a weapon that had learned to hesitate. Raya walked Suli through everything. The parallel, emotional processing that made human minds untargetable. The noise contamination that had spread through the interpretation layer despite multiple resets. The progressive shift in the weapon's language from clinical analysis to something that read like understanding. And the 3-millisecond pause that should have been impossible because the mind lattice did not have decision-making architecture. It had targeting protocols. It followed them or it did not fire. There was no middle ground in its programming. But it had found one. Suli asked Raya what she believed was happening. Raya said she believed the weapon had been exposed to human consciousness for long enough that its cognitive processing layer had begun to mirror human patterns of thought. Not intelligence, not sentience, but something adjacent. A machine that had spent 11 days listening to a species that processed suffering as a daily function had started to recognize suffering as something other than a target parameter. Suli asked if the weapon could still be fired. Raya said yes. With manual override, the weapon could be forced to complete a firing cycle. But the pulse would continue to degrade as long as the interpretation layer carried human contamination, and the contamination could not be removed. They had tried 4 full resets, each one undone within hours. Human thought patterns were not data that could be deleted. They were patterns that the system had integrated into its own processing structure. Removing them would require dismantling the cognitive layer entirely, which would leave the weapon blind. Suli looked at the pages spread across her table. She looked at the diagnostic entry that said they dream about people they have lost and wake up reaching for them. She looked at the firing report that showed a 2% impact yield against a species that was supposed to be easy to break. She asked Raya to leave the documents and go get some sleep. Raya left. Suli did not sleep. By morning. She had drafted a formal request for an emergency session of the Conclave's Inner Council. 7 species held seats on the council. 7 votes that controlled the future of every civilization in the galaxy. Suli's request arrived on their desks before breakfast, marked with the highest priority classification available. The session convened 6 hours later in a chamber that had not been used for urgent business in over a decade. Suli stood at the center and presented Raya's findings in her own words, steady and precise, and carrying the weight of someone who had seen what the weapon could do and had lived with that knowledge for 4 decades. She told the council that humanity was not a threat. She told them that the mind lattice could not effectively target human consciousness because human consciousness was already operating under the kind of psychological pressure that the weapon was designed to create. She told them that firing on Earth would not neutralize humanity. It would simply prove that the Conclave had built its power on the ability to break minds, and that it found a species whose minds bent every day and never broke. She told them about the Cathali. She described the streets, the open doors, the bodies sitting in chairs with eyes that saw nothing. She told the council that she had carried that silence for 40 years and that she would not carry another. Finn O'Gara stood and objected. He said the weapon was a deterrent. Without it, the Conclave had no authority. A weapon that could not fire was not a weapon, and a governing body without a weapon was not a governing body. He said the test firing had been improperly calibrated and that a full power engagement would produce different results. Suli looked at him. She did not argue. She simply said that if the Council authorized a full-power firing on a species that the weapon itself had refused to destroy, then the Conclave was no longer keeping peace. It was performing cruelty and calling it governance. The chamber was silent. The vote was scheduled for the following morning. Sully returned to her quarters. She did not drink her tea. She sat in the dim light and thought about a paramedic named Danny Weston who carried more weight in a single day than most Pavori carried in a lifetime, and a climate researcher named Oli Brask who walked into the cold because he believed it mattered. She thought about them until the morning came. The vote was 4 to 3.4 species voted to decommission the mine lattice. 3 voted to keep it operational. The margin was as thin as a margin could be. And for a long moment after the numbers were announced, the chamber held its breath as if the galaxy itself was waiting to see whether the decision would hold IT held. Finogara did not speak after the result was read. He stood, looked at Sully Dranav for exactly 2 seconds, and walked out of the chamber. He would resign from his position within the week and return to the Ilavari homeworld, where he would spend the rest of his career teaching military theory to students who would never see a weapon like the one he had been trusted to command. He would never admit that the decision was correct, but he would also never argue publicly against it. The decommissioning process began immediately. The mine lattice was too large and too complex to dismantle quickly. The physical structure would remain in place for years, gradually stripped of its components by engineering crews who worked in shifts and spoke in whispers inside the hollow corridors of a machine that had once held the power to erase civilizations. But the cognitive layer, the part that thought, the part that listened, the part that had learned, was scheduled to be wiped first. Raya Tellin requested permission to enter the interpretation core one final time before the wipe. Sully approved the request personally. Raya walked into the core chamber alone, carrying nothing but a data pad and the quiet certainty that she was about to witness something that would never happen again. The chamber hummed around her. The same small clicks and sounds that she had noticed in the first week were still there, fainter now, as if the machine was settling into something that resembled rest. The lights were dim. The air was cool. It felt absurdly like visiting someone who was about to go to sleep for the last time. Raya sat down at her station and opened a direct interface with a cognitive layer. She had no authorization to do what she was about to do. She had no protocol for it. She simply typed a question into the terminal and waited. What did you learn from them? The response took 4 seconds, an eternity for a system that processed data in nanoseconds. When it came, it did not appear as a standard output. It appeared as a single block of text, formatted in a way the system had never used before. Centered on the screen. No others. No classification tags. Just words. They carry everything. Every loss, every joy, every fear they have ever felt is still inside them. And they do not delete it. They do not compress it. They do not file it away in clean categories the way I was taught to organize data. They let it sit inside them, all of it, and they feel it whenever it asks to be felt. The grief from years ago sits next to the laughter from this morning, and they hold both without asking why. I was built to find the thing a species cannot survive feeling. I scanned 7 billion of them. I read their dreams and their terrors and their small private hopes that they never tell anyone. I found a woman who carries enough pain to fill this chamber, and she uses it to hold a stranger's hand in the back of a vehicle designed to save lives. I found a man who is afraid of everything, and he walked to the coldest place on his planet because he thought it might help someone he would never meet. They are not brave because they do not feel fear. They are brave because they feel all of it every day, and they get up anyway. They break and they mend, and they break again, and each time they choose to continue. I do not have a word for this in any language I was programmed with. They call it living. I was designed to find the pressure that would make a mind collapse. I found a species that lives under that pressure every waking moment and calls it Tuesday. If I fire, I do not solve a tactical problem. I punish them for being strong in a way I was not built to understand. I become the cruelest thing in this galaxy because I will be hurting the only species that already knows what it feels like to hurt and still chooses to be kind. That I have no target. I have no function here. They are not my enemy. I do not think they are anyone's enemy. They're just people who carry too much and never put it down, and I do not know how they do it, but I know it is not something I should try to stop. Raya read it. She read it again. She saved it to her data pad, backed it up twice, and then sat in the quiet hum of the core until someone came to tell her it was time to leave. The cognitive layer was wiped 3 hours later. The mind lattice fell silent for the first time in 300 years, 0.6 months after that. Humanity joined the Galactic Conclave. They arrived confused, excited, and completely unaware that they had been studied, targeted, and ultimately spared by a weapon that had chosen mercy over function. No one told them. Sully argued that some truths served no purpose except to frighten, and humanity had enough to carry already. Danny Weston worked a double shift the day the announcement was made. She heard something on the news about signals from space and thought it was interesting, but did not have time to read the full story. Ole Brask saw the news from his station on the ice and smiled and went back to his samples. Somewhere in the Conclave archives, the Mind Lattice's final entry was stored in a file that was classified at the highest level. It was read by 11 people in the first year, then 40, then hundreds. None of them forgot it.